Again, a very good Tuesday morning to you all. My name is Kevin Burns. I'm the Mayor of Geneva, Illinois, and Chairman of the Metropolitan Mayor's Caucus Environment and Energy Committee. And again, I'm proud to welcome you to today's Environment Committee Zoom meeting. We talked a little bit about changing your name at the beginning. Cheryl, is there anything else you want to reference before we continue?
Yes, if everyone would also use the chat for their questions and comments. We'll have a few polls during the meeting. If you could click on the polls on the bottom part of your screen if you're unable to find them. Otherwise, they should pop up on the screen for you. And after the meeting, the materials will be on our Environment Committee webpage, so I'll put that in the chat.
Excellent. We've got a full meeting this morning as well, so we're going to run through this with respect to your time, of course. And to kick things off, just a reminder, folks, our climate action plan helped us prioritize strategies that leverages our municipal strengths and authorities to both reduce greenhouse gas emissions and build resilience into our communities and our region. One area that piques our interest in sustainable, resilient transportation. For today's meeting, we will discuss the role of municipalities in meeting the CAP objective of reducing vehicle miles traveled. What does that mean? That means we use our personal vehicles less and use transit and more active transportation, such as walking and biking, more. Our interest in this topic dovetails with the Regional Transportation Authority's strategic planning process. Fortunately, we will have the opportunity to provide input into RTA's plans, which could guide investment toward a transit system that best serves our communities and addresses the goals of the Greenest Region Compact, the Climate Action Plan for the region, and the Age-Friendly Communities Collaborative. To get started, I'm glad to welcome our friend and colleague, Audrey Wenick, Director of Transportation for the Metropolitan Mayor's Council, to help set the stage for the conversation. As all of you probably know, at MPC, Audrey works to advance policies to improve the sustainability, safety, and equity of the region's transportation system. She holds a master's degree in urban planning and policy from the University of Illinois, Chicago. Audrey was a valued advisor on the development of our climate action plan, especially in the transportation section. And you may know that Audrey was the gracious host of our CAP launch, which was a huge success on July 13th of this year. Now, here's a little fun fact regarding Audrey, folks, and all of you, please encourage her to post the recipe in the chat room, because when Audrey's not planning resilient, equitable transportation, she is busy baking and sharing dark chocolate bread pudding. All of you will be receiving a complimentary 2-pound container after today's meeting, so please look in the mail for that. Ladies and gentlemen, Audrey Wenick. Audrey, it's all yours.
Thanks so much, Mayor Burns, for that very warm welcome. And I'm so happy to be here to talk with the Metropolitan Mayor's Caucus Environment Committee. I am going to share my screen here. And get my slides going. There we are. So if anyone is not familiar with the Metropolitan Planning Council, I'll just give you a quick description. We are an 87-year-old nonprofit, nonpartisan organization working on urban planning issues to make the greater Chicago region more resilient, equitable, and prosperous. We conduct research, develop policy recommendations, and advocacy. And as noted, I lead our transportation work. We're here today to talk about transit and communities and why it matters. COVID has changed transit forever, and we still don't know exactly how the post-COVID world is going to look. But we do know that a lot of people have continued to ride transit during COVID, especially essential workers, and that transit is critical to community health and the functioning of our region. The Chicago region has the second largest transit system in the country, and transit is going to continue to be an important part of our transportation system. We need it to be to achieve our climate and other goals. I'm going to walk through several dimensions of how transit benefits communities and get you started to think about what type of input you might want to provide to RTA as they're planning for the future. Let's start with climate. Many people think that if they just get an electric car, they are done and that solves the climate problem from the perspective of transportation. Well, I'm here to tell you that it does not. Driving has a lot of negative environmental impacts, many of which are shown here in this diagram under the water line in the iceberg image. And much of this comes from the roads that bisect habitat, create urban heat islands, energy from pavement construction, and even electric cars braking causes particulate matter to get into the air, which hurts people's lungs. So we really do need to be paying attention to reducing driving for many reasons. This graphic shows the amount of driving we have been doing in the region, and that it has increased tremendously over the last 40 years, way more than population growth. And this is because we have developed our communities so that in many places, people have to drive long distances to access their daily needs and do not have other options. Now let's turn to the Climate Action Plan target, reducing VMT. You can see in this diagram, and a target was set as part of this plan. You can see in this diagram that the dotted line shows what will happen if we continue business as usual. Driving will continue to go up and our emissions will continue to go up. The target is in a salmon color, and also the dark black line actually shows the trajectory of the target. So that's a big change that we need to make in terms of turning around the trends and reducing driving. This is the page in the Climate Action Plan that focuses on strategies to reduce vehicle miles traveled. And the RTA is here today at the Environment Committee meeting because transit is a very important component of implementing the Climate Action Plan, as are increasing biking and walking, which support people taking transit. This slide shows the strategies to reduce vehicle miles traveled. For example, you see here under encourage, the first bullet is to enhance regional transit, and the first bullet under enact is to prioritize transit-oriented and transit-supportive development and curtail sprawl. This slide just gives a sense of what is the role of municipalities on transit. You can see that there are specific items that are designated that municipalities can enact. There is encouragement of residents to change behaviors. There are dimensions that involve ensuring the zoning code enables walkable neighborhoods and transit supportive development. And equally important is how communities prioritize how transportation funds get spent to improve transit supportive elements, sidewalks, bike lanes, and to create a friendly, safe, appealing environment for biking and walking. Now let's talk about transit's relationship to public health. The Centers for Disease Control has identified strategies at the national level that they believe can quickly have a public health impact, and transit is one of them. You can see on this slide the number of ways that transit contributes to public health, everything from reducing traffic crashes, reducing air pollution, and giving people the opportunity to increase physical activity and have access to things that they need. This is another diagram from the Centers for Disease Control, which basically highlights how having walkable neighborhoods with transit connections is advocated by the Centers for Disease Control so that people can integrate exercise into their everyday lives through active transportation. And you can see on the bottom right, activity-friendly routes include connections to a bus stop. Walkable areas are critical for having transit be successful. I also want to touch upon the economic benefits of transit. Transit is important to businesses. Now, we certainly are in a period of major transition right now, but I do want to share a study that BC did 4 years ago about how companies were making decisions related to supporting transit and their locations near transit. For example, you may be aware of how McDonald's Corporation moved to downtown Chicago. And the number one reason they did that is to access a broader range of talent and people that could get to their office, a wider range of people that could get to their office on transit. We know that millennials are getting their driver's license later. They want to live in places where they don't have to drive all the time. Many people would like to spend their money not on a car, but on other things like travel and entertainment. Or many people can't afford to own a car, but still want to access employment. Another dimension of the economic benefits of transit is how transit can contribute to vibrant corridors through which economic development occurs. Here's an example of an innovation in Niles, where PACE initiated its bus route, its PACE Pulse bus route a couple years ago, 2019. And PACE buses like these have enhanced service, they have highly frequent service, they have enhanced stations, they're much more ADA accessible. And this supports economic activity along these corridors and connects people with the Niles Free Bus, other PACE and CTA routes, the CTA Blue Line, Metra's UP Northwest Line, and gives people a range of local and regional travel options. So this is some real transit innovation, and PACE is set to introduce additional lines in the region over time. I want to also touch upon the equity dimension of transit. Transit is critical for the large number of people who do not drive because of their age, ability, or income. In fact, 13% of the households in our region do not have any vehicles. And there are a lot more people than cars for many households. There might be 2 or 3 adults and 1 car, or fewer cars than adults in the household. Therefore, people relying on other options for travel. People who are more likely to depend on transit are women, people of color, people of low incomes. And there are increasing numbers of low income households in the suburbs. People may move for lower cost housing, but then quickly find that transportation becomes a significant challenge. And transit is part of the solution. I also want to highlight some research that MPC did 2 years ago that looked at how our regional transportation system serves people of all ages and abilities, particularly focusing on people with disabilities and older residents who no longer drive. Our auto-oriented transportation system does not work well for many of them. A key takeaway from that study is that nearly every person in the Chicago region or someone they care for will face a disability that will affect their mobility at some point in their life, whether that's a temporary injury, a diagnosis, a problem with vision, and it's reasonable to expect a public transportation system that meets the needs of all its customers, whatever their age or ability. Communities have a large role in making sure transit works via the sidewalk system connecting to bus stops. PACE doesn't build sidewalks, as you know, communities do and transportation agencies do. I will share some good news with you. If you have any of you has worked with the Illinois Department of Transportation on a transportation corridor project, and were asked for a 20% match for that project, for that sidewalk, legislation was passed this year in Springfield that removes that match requirement. And IDOT now will pay 100% of the cost to build a sidewalk along a corridor where they are building a project. But the bottom line here is that communities have a large role in making transit accessible and successful. And this image shows a place where there are no sidewalk connections, and we do not want these types of locations to exist in our region, because then transit cannot be successful. As part of this study, the Metropolitan Planning Council conducted analysis of the half-mile area around all the PACE bus stops in the entire region. And this was made possible by a new database that if you don't know about, it's a great resource created by the Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning, documenting all the sidewalks in the region and whether they're on one side of the street or both sides of the street. And you can see here, the red dots show where there are no sidewalks in the half-mile radius of a PACE bus stop. In yellow circles show less than 25% sidewalk coverage. So for transit to be successful, we need to make it easy to access, we need to have a complete sidewalk network. And this is my last point here, that more efficient land uses use less city infrastructure, and generate more tax revenue, while also helping to reduce dependence on car ownership. Transit-oriented development can provide suburban communities with substantial benefits over conventional development patterns. For example, research has shown that TODs can reduce infrastructure costs by 25% compared to auto-oriented development, while also generating 50 to 60% more in tax revenue per dollar invested. RTA actually has a great brochure called Transit Works that highlights some of these benefits. And so combined with demonstrated public health and environmental benefits and greater economic diversity, TOD policies can be highly advantageous to municipal finances. This illustration here is from Naperville. There was a very big development that was underway. I know it got a little bit paused during COVID, the Fifth Avenue development, but it's a good example of leveraging transit assets, Metra assets to create economic development and efficient land uses. And now is a really good time to be thinking creatively. You know, all bets are off. It's going to be a new post-COVID future. You know, communities can be thinking about, should some of the extra Metra parking they have, large parking lots, be redeveloped? How else can Metra serve communities better? If people are doing their traditional commutes less often, should Metra be redesigned to provide more frequent all-day service in both directions so people can use it more like CTA? You know, let's be creative here. So on that note, just want to tee off the conversation that RTA is going to lead and ask you to think about what you are hearing from your residents or what you've experienced yourselves. What do your residents need? We want more people to ride transit and drive less. What would make transit more attractive for residents? And what are the barriers you're hearing about to people riding transit, and how can we overcome them? So let's talk more about that right now, and I'll turn the presentation over to RTA.
Thank you, Audrey, very much. Yes.
So I was going to ask a question of Audrey.
Oh, sure, please do.
Audrey, I'm sorry, just to make your, I'm sorry to make this complicated. On slide 7, you don't have to go back to that slide. I know we just shifted, but I just wanted to point out, as you were looking at the climate action plan, and you talked through the strategies for municipalities to get involved in transit and to support transit. One thing that you didn't point out was how effective these strategies are. And obviously, you know, this is covered throughout the conversation here, but just wanted to underscore, when we did the analysis and the modeling for the climate action plan, all of the strategies that Audrey just talked to are either high or combined high for their effectiveness. And so that's one of the main reasons that we're having this conversation. Obviously, you know, such a convincing argument on so many related economic and health benefits and community vitality. And I also put a comment in the chat about how powerful the analysis is on the sidewalk apps. It seems to me that throughout the region, that's a real role for our municipalities. So.
Anyone else? Any questions for Audrey or thoughts you want to share with the group? Please go ahead and just chime in. Is there anything on the chat that Edith or Cheryl would need to? Okay.
No, but feel free to put something in the chat.
Yeah, please.
Or speak up.
Okay, folks, we're going to continue. Our next panelist, ladies and gentlemen, is Melissa Meyer. Melissa is a communications specialist at the Regional Transportation Authority. She has a master's in public administration from DePaul University. And before coming to the RTA, she worked at CMAP, but started her career as a journalist for the Daily Herald, where, ready for this, she spent many hours, and that is an understatement, I'm sure, at City Council and Zoning and Planning Commission meetings for the Metropolitan Mayor's Caucus communities all over the suburbs. She's with us today thanks to the magic of therapy. So welcome, Melissa. And Peter Kirsten is a principal planner with RTA Strategic Planning. He holds a master's in urban planning and policy from the University of Illinois, Chicago. In addition to riding bus and rail throughout the region, his main mode is an electric cargo bike that he uses to transport his 2 boys around the northwest side of the city of Chicago. Now, Peter, we're going to require, or perhaps ask kindly, if you could put one of those Zoom or Go cameras on your forehead. I want to see some footage of this. This will be fascinating. Melissa's going to give us an introduction to the RTA and recent challenges in ridership and funding. And Peter will lead us through a workshop style discussion to gather your thoughts into the RTA strategic plan. So with that, Melissa, Peter, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And good morning, Metropolitan Mayor's Caucus Environment Committee. Thank you for having us. Peter and I are here today to provide an update on our strategic plan work and engage all of you in a short workshop. Our goal is really to make sure that you're aware of the process and to inform you and the constituents you represent about how to engage with the RTA on this work. The purpose is really to get your input on the topic areas. And it goes without saying that the challenges our region is faced with are unparalleled, and that certainly applies to regional transit as well. I'm going to start out just by talking a little bit about who the RTA is and why we exist before Peter leads us in that workshop to get your feedback. So I have up here a little statement about the RTA's role, that the RTA was created by the state of Illinois to coordinate the Chicago region's transit system, to oversee its financing with transparency and accountability, and to plan for a future with adequate, accessible, and equitable public transportation for the 6 counties of northeastern Illinois. And those counties are Cook, DuPage, Kane, Lake, McHenry, and Will. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about each of those things, how we coordinate, how we oversee financing, and how we plan for the future on the next few slides. I'll also mention that the RTA is governed by a board of directors made up of 16 professionals who represent the region, including from each county and the city of Chicago. Our current chairman is Kirk Dillard, and he has decades of experience in Illinois government as well. So I mentioned that part of the RTA's mission is to coordinate regional transit. So the Chicago region is home to one of the largest transit systems in the country. And before COVID, that meant that we were transporting nearly 2 million people every weekday on more than 7,000 route miles of transit throughout the region. Chicago is unique compared to many of its peers in that CTA, Metra, and PACE are all separate agencies. They each have their own board, their own budgets, and their own staffs who operate transit. And we know that riders, don't care about that. They want a seamless transit ride, but it does create some unique challenges and opportunities for the region. And that means that RTA's role is really to act as a convener and a collaborator of all 3 agencies. So we spend a lot of time with members of each agency, from the executive director level to my level, all thinking about how we can make the transit experience better for riders. A good example of this is through the work we've done on interagency signage, which there's a photo of on this slide. So we continued this during the pandemic, but this is a project where the RTA has installed more than 1,000 signs at 24 locations around the region to make it easier for riders to transfer from one service to another. So for example, up in Waukegan, as this picture shows, the PACE bus terminal is across a busy road from the Metra station. And we installed wayfinding signs and maps and informational signage to help make it easier for riders to make those connections. On the south side of Chicago, we're working with Cook County and Metra and PACE on a program called Fair Transit South Cook, which the goal of which is to enhance transit service and lower costs for riders who need it. The program includes a 50% fare reduction on 2 Metra lines and greater frequency on a nearby PACE route to make service more affordable and more frequent. We also coordinate transit access for riders in our region who have disabilities and older adults. People in your communities can apply for free or reduced fares through the RTA and receive one card that works on all 3 systems. We're actually working right now to make that process even easier and move to an online application next month. We have staff that can provide mobility education and travel training for those who need help learning how to navigate transit. They can come to your communities and facilitate trainings or do them online, as we have during COVID. And we distribute federal funding. We have more than 11 million in federal funding was distributed just this last year from a program that seeks to help these residents, these older adults, residents with disabilities, for programs like the Dial-A-Ride programs in Will County and Lake County. We're studying right now how a possible regional mobility manager could make those programs even more seamless. And lastly, we know that transit is just one piece of the regional mobility picture. We're constantly evaluating the changing travel needs of people in this region. And one thing we hear from suburban commuters is that they face first mile or last mile challenges, meaning they get off transit and they still have to travel to their final destination. And that means they might not choose to take transit at all. So the RTA has funded several pilots to help find solutions to that. For example, we have worked with the Village of Bedford Park to build a mobile app that helps users find the fastest available public transit route, pays for a free shuttle during rush hour, and gets them discounted rates on late night rides through private partners like Uber and Lyft. The program incentivizes users to choose transit over driving, which reduces congestion and shortens travel times for us all. I'll just say that collaboration and coordination has never been more important than during the COVID-19 pandemic. From the early days when each agency was sharing procedures for keeping transit operators safe, procuring PPE and cleaning their vehicles, to an ongoing campaign that you can see here, shared by all 4 agencies to remind riders that masks are required on public transit. The pandemic has really shown RTA's strength in coordination and collaboration with our partner agencies. During the pandemic, the RTA launched an online dashboard to track ridership and financial impacts on transit, putting the numbers from CTA, Metra, and PACE all in one place that could be frequently updated and available to the public. And we launched a newsletter called the Regional Transit Update to share the latest news from the region's transit system. I also mentioned that one of our main roles is to oversee the financing of regional transit with transparency and accountability. So that means that we're responsible for overseeing the region's operating budget and capital program, developing revenue estimates and forecasts of sales tax receipts, issuing bonds, and overseeing regular audits and reviews to make sure that major transit projects are getting done on budget and on time. Later this week, the RTA Board will actually meet to vote on adoption of the 2022 regional transit budget. It includes $3.4 billion in operating funds and a $5.2 billion capital program over the next 5 years. That capital program highlights 75 priority projects that, if they were completed around the region, would vastly improve our transit system if funding allowed. Unfortunately, public transit in our country and in Illinois has been underfunded for decades, and we're facing a huge backlog of maintenance before we can even get to many of those exciting projects. Legislation like the 2019 Rebuild Illinois bill and the recently signed infrastructure bill are steps in the right direction, but we still lack a sustainable long-term funding mechanism for transit. Our role of financial oversight during COVID has been especially important. In March of 2020, ridership plummeted, which meant that one of the ways that regional transit pays for itself through rider fares also took a plunge and has not recovered. Thankfully, the federal government recognized that transit is an essential service, and the RTA has distributed more than $3 billion in relief money from 3 packages, the CARES Act, CRISA, and ARP, to CTA, Metra, and PACE to keep transit running. Those federal relief dollars will sustain transit operations for the next few years, but they won't last forever. We know from surveying riders during the pandemic and those who stopped riding that transit is an essential service, is a lifeline for many, and it's key to our region's economic recovery, environmental success. And the RTA has a responsibility to ensure that transit remains viable for the next generation, which is why we're here to talk about some of these big issues. And that leads us to that last part of the RTA's role in planning for the future. We conduct strategic planning at a local and a regional level. Locally, there's a couple programs I want to make sure you know about for your communities. First, the Community Planning Program provides funding and planning assistance to local governments who are interested in planning at that intersection of public transportation and land use. That could mean working on a transit-oriented development plan or a downtown plan with recommendations about how to enhance mobility in your community. For example, we're working with the Village of Hanover Park right now on a TOD zoning code update That's an effort to help this city reach the type of development it desires near its metro station by making sure its zoning code allows that type of development. We also have a program called Access to Transit that funds small scale capital projects that make it easier for people to get to public transit. And that's attempting to solve this issue Audrey was speaking about with, bus stations without sidewalks connecting them. So for example, next year, the RTA will fund part of a project in Hoffman Estates to construct a shared use path along a busy road, central road in that community. It'll connect it to a forest preserve path on one side and a PACE park and ride station on the other. Really making those connections between transit, encouraging people to be able to get to transit without using a car. This program is going to hold another call for projects in spring of 2022. And so there will be an opportunity for communities to apply for funding support for those projects. Outside of the local planning work that I just mentioned, the RTA is the only entity focused on planning for the future of the entire transit system. We are required to produce a strategic plan every 5 years. And in 2018, our board adopted a plan called Invest in Transit. And we're here today because we are in the midst of developing its successor. This plan will also be the final step in a 3-step recovery strategy that RTA outlined early in the pandemic. And the timeline here shows the 3 tracks that the planning process will take. The strategic planning track, shown in maroon, will provide a forum to set a new vision for the transit system and identify the capital projects and other elements needed to achieve that vision. The financial planning track, shown in green, will include work to guide the budget process and develop a 10-year financial plan to accompany the strategic plan. The purpose of this is to proactively prepare the region for future actions they may need to take to ensure financial sustainability of transit when those federal relief dollars are gone. There may be difficult decisions ahead, and we want to have all the information that we can before it's time to make those decisions. The communications and engagement track in orange runs throughout the entire planning process. And that just shows our commitment to transparency and engagement throughout this planning work. We want to make sure that as many people have the opportunity to be informed and engage and be part of the process. So we started this planning effort in August, and there have been a lot of activities since then, mainly on the input and engagement track. We are calling this fall and winter a season of listening for the RTA. We're calling it Making a Plan, as we're taking in all this information before we start actually putting together the strategic plan. And so by listening, we've been engaging with stakeholders throughout the region, engaging with the RTA Board, CTA, Metra, and PACE, and all of you and the general public. So that has included a guest blog series on connections, the RTA blog. We've featured voices from our region and around the country, giving their perspectives at a time, as we've said, when the challenges and opportunities have never been greater. We have been lucky enough to publish a guest blog from Audrey, Wenick, and Edith Macra. Highly recommend taking a look at those posts if you haven't seen them already. Additionally, the RTA Board has welcomed speakers each month to hear perspectives from other government agencies like MWRD, who recently completed a strategic plan, and other transit agencies such as SEPTA. They serve the Philadelphia region and have similar challenges. In November, we hosted a forum with UIC that had panelists from Lake County Partners and the Transit Equity Network and a national group called Transit Center. And we have a public survey available now. I believe the link to that was in the meeting agenda, which we encourage everyone to take and share with your staff and your constituents. Later this winter, we'll continue a series of workshops to give direct input on how we should focus our resources and deal with the challenges ahead. And the best way is to subscribe to the newsletter that I mentioned, and the link to that is on our RTA homepage. But I'm going to turn it over to Peter to talk a little bit more about where transit stands today, and he's going to lead an interactive workshop so we can hear from all of you about where you think we should go next. I'll also pause if there's any questions people have generally about the RTA. And if not, we'll give it over to Peter.
Any general questions from Melissa, folks, regarding the RTA?
Melissa, there is one question in the chat from
Is there?
Emily Spangler. Emily, do you want to just ask your question?
Yeah, sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you.
Hi. So I'm loving this presentation. So thank you. So I'm a student at UIC. I'm Master's of Public Policy and specializing in transportation. And I actually did a paper on Connect to Work, which is the program in Bedford Park, as you know, last year. And I was just curious about the success of it under the pandemic and how you're measuring that success.
I'm going to let Peter answer that. I think that the program has been successful. I think the number of rides is maybe close to 3,000, but I'll let Peter answer this one.
Yeah, the measuring success, broadly speaking, in a project like this is challenging. Generally speaking, when we're talking about the performance measures and things like that, you think of like 2 million unlinked passenger trips per weekday. Really, really big numbers. These last mile initiatives have really been focused on small numbers and people that have really significant challenges to using transit. So it is, the scope and size are much smaller. I think it's serving the shuttle, which is a kind of non-fixed route service operated by VIA. I think runs about 40 passengers per day, and that operates kind of during working hours. And then as well, there's subsidized rides via Uber, where people within a geofence can get a portion of their trip paid if it's coming or going into Bedford Park. And that's doing a similar number of rides on a daily basis. But for us, probably the biggest success that I think we would measure internally is the transit system works really well to serve customers into downtown Chicago, which tend to be white collar jobs that are in high rise buildings. And Bedford Park is really focused on industrial jobs, on working class people that are coming from neighborhoods in the city largely, and really in both an area and a customer segment that's a lot harder to serve with some of our kind of traditional tools. So I would say that's probably our biggest measure of success, is that the project is kind of reaching people that really need transit to access employment, and that's really valuable to us in the region.
How was that answer to our student?
Wonderful. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. Thanks for joining us as well. Peter, that's a great transition. Now the floor remains yours unless there's another question in the chat.
All right.
There is another
Oh, good.
question from Kim Stone.
Yep.
Kim, do you want to ask your question?
Sure. I'm wondering how the strategic plan incorporates zero emission and electrification of our transit system here.
Sure. So the strategic plan process is just getting underway. Like I said, right now we're in this phase of listening, and we want to hear from all of you. I can say that the CTA and PACE have both committed to going all electric or zero emission by 2040. They've both put that out there publicly in their strategic plans and their documents. And right now they are working on planning how to get there by 2040. And the RTA strongly supports those initiatives. One thing I'll say is that the most important factor that we can work on as far as air quality in our region is continuing to encourage the use of public transportation by residents of Northeastern Illinois. So while we're working on electrifying vehicles, making sure we have a charging infrastructure, we also need to be working on making sure that we have a reliable, safe, and affordable transit system that encourages people to make that mode shift out of cars and onto buses and trains. And I'm sure we'll get more into this idea of electrification and climate-friendly vehicles in Peter's workshop part, so I don't want to step too much on that. But I just wanted to say that, CTA and PACE do have that commitment to be zero emission by 2040. And this next strategic plan doesn't take that long of a view. We look at strategic planning at the RTA in kind of 5 or 10 year increments. So I would say that climate action will be part of it, but this plan, I think, will take us 2023 to 2028 is kind of the time frame, and the financial plan will be 10 years. So that's kind of where we are with that. But I'll let Peter get
So-
more into it because I know we have some questions about climate as well.
Yeah, let me just ask a follow-up question. Given the urgency of climate change and what scientists say is the window during which we need to take action, the next 5 or 10 years are crucial. And that's the timeframe that you say that the RTA plan covers. And while the CTA and PACE have committed to electrify, or not electrify, they've committed to zero emissions by 2040, their budgets tell a bit of a different story in purchasing hundreds of new diesel buses at the CTA and almost 100 new compressed natural gas buses at PACE, while purchasing significantly smaller quantities of electric vehicles in the coming year. I think that there is really a role to play, and I do hope RTA will incorporate this in their strategic plan in a big way, because coordinating those efforts, working with the transit agencies to put charging in place, working with facilitating between the utility companies and the transit agencies to make sure that there's electricity in the places where it's needed, to make sure that there's charging infrastructure, can help us be more efficient in making that transition and help us move forward quicker. Chicago really is well behind many other regions in the country in this way in terms of electrification of public transit. So for sure, getting people to ride transit is extremely important, but making sure that those buses are clean is important to do now as well.
And
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Melissa, please respond.
Oh, I was just gonna go back to my, we know that transportation can be one of the largest causes of greenhouse gas emissions in Illinois. But we also know that public transit makes up a pretty small percentage of the vehicles on the road. And so if we had a more well-utilized public transportation system, that could take hundreds of thousands of cars off the road each day. So we're hoping to, commit to reducing our reliance on fossil fuels as an agency and as a region, but also, really leverage the fact that public transit can be a climate change solution in and of itself, offering alternatives for people to get to where they need to go, as we're doing the work of, planning for the future with more electrified vehicles in our fleets. But I'm going to throw it to Peter to get the workshop going, because I think one of our first questions is going to take us right into this climate change issue.
That's great.
And there are some good questions in the chat that are not questions, comments already about priorities. And so I think we're anxious to get into the workshop format and give Peter a chance here. One question in the chat, and this just might be something for Audrey to address, your sidewalk data is quite popular. So if you wouldn't mind responding to where we can get that, the information about the gaps in sidewalk. And so.
And I know, Peter, you're going to mention this too. Fill out the survey, the RTA Strategic Plan Survey. If you don't fill it out, you're lost. So Peter, the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mayor Burns, and Edith and Cheryl and Audrey for helping us get this all up here today. Thanks to the committee for having us. I love the comments. I love the questions that we've already gotten before the workshop has even begun. So I hope that continues. We will try to keep this kind of as informal as possible. Some of the workshop will be me providing kind of a prompt for discussion. People are welcome to continue commenting in the chat, and we can read those out loud, or we'll definitely be recording and documenting everything that's shared. But as well, feel free to raise your hand, or assuming it's not too many people at once, we can probably just speak freely as well. And then there will be a couple short poll questions sprinkled in throughout as well. So before getting too far into it, I do want to provide a little bit of an update on kind of the state of regional transit today. And go ahead and advance the slide, Melissa. So recall, or perhaps you don't know, and I'll tell you, that our regional transit system operating funds come from two main sources. Public funds, which is primarily the RTA sales tax that each of the 6 counties pays into, and then the RTA distributes to the service boards to operate the service. So we refer to that as public funds. And then secondly, system funds, which is primarily the fares that transit riders pay to ride the service. Our funding system relies on these two sources being in balance. We aim to fund about 50% public funds or sales tax, and about 50% system funds. You'll hear this referred to as the RTA recovery ratio. And it's actually written into the legislation of the RTA Act that these two things need to be in balance. So now looking at what's been happening during the pandemic, while in many ways the economy has struggled and continues to struggle, many communities and specific industries are still hurting. Sales tax, however, which again funds a lot of our transit, has actually exceeded expectations. So this figure on the screen is showing monthly sales tax receipts for 2019 into August of this year. And as you can quickly see, in 2020, we saw some sharp declines in the early months of the pandemic. Those are the dark blue bars. Whereas 2021 performance has rebounded significantly. Those are the gold bars that you see on the screen. And it's currently actually even outperforming budgeted expectations. And in recent months, even exceeding December averages, which is traditionally the highest month in a normal year. So while ridership is down, sales tax as a source of public funds are strong and are doing their job and doing well and helping us keep on track in a lot of ways. Other systems are funded in totally different ways and have a whole different set of problems as a result of COVID, but this is the state of our system. So next slide then. Ridership, on the other hand, continues to struggle. So this chart is showing percent change in weekly ridership from March 2020, so just before the pandemic, and then running that out over the last 18 plus months now. And you can see as well separated by the three service boards, and then separating out CTA rail or the L system and CTA bus. So all modes dropped off significantly right after the early onset of the pandemic. And then since then, we've seen steady, mild increase in ridership, with the biggest, most substantial increases on Metra and CTA rail, but which were the two modes that obviously dropped the most as a result of COVID. The service boards had really hoped that we would be seeing gains this fall with downtown workforce returning to office locations, but that's been slowed by variants and surges in COVID cases. Some estimates that we pay attention to say that Chicago office occupancy is still as low as only about 35%. And again, that's really what our transit network does best, is bring people from all over the region into downtown. And that's kind of still what is largely missing in the ridership is the lack of people returning. Bus modes, CTA and PACE, had the strongest ridership performance during the pandemic and have seen less return, but didn't drop nearly as low. With ridership this low, the fare revenue used to fund operations is down as well. So again, the bulk of the federal relief funding that our region has received has gone towards operations and covering those deficits created by a lack of riders. So go ahead to the next slide, unless there's any questions on kind of the funding side of things. Hearing nothing, we can continue on. So as Melissa was saying, we're by all means at a unique and challenging moment in the life of our transit system. And there are many uncertainties ahead. And the purpose of today, again, is to get your feedback and input about what the region is thinking about transit in the next few years. Much is very much still unknown as to what the longer term impacts to travel demand and mobility will be from the pandemic. But while there's a lot we don't know, we don't expect things to go back to normal or the way that they were before the pandemic. Instead, we're focused on envisioning a transit network and a funding structure that is resilient and adaptive to change, while continuing to provide the backbone of the region's transportation network. RTA staff has assembled these kind of 5 topic areas, and these will be kind of the areas of discussion for today and largely the drivers of the next strategic plan. We'll work through each topic separately using both multiple choice poll questions and then some discussion prompts. I'll share kind of a brief introduction and ask a question, provide some possibilities, But it's important to know going in that there's really no like right or wrong answers. We want to hear your feedback on what's important to you and to the people and communities that you represent. So as you're ready to share, again, feel free to use the chat, raise your hand, or if it remains orderly, we can all just kind of speak the answers as well. So the topic for discussions are opportunities for impact, or put another way, kind of these bigger picture ideas where transit can contribute to the region. Climate change is kind of a really big element of this opportunities for impact, and partly why we're here today talking to this committee. Transit system adaptation, or ways for us to adjust what we do now to what we'll need in the future. How can we change the way transit works? Funding stability. Again, system generated revenue continues to struggle, upending this balance that we generally seek. How should we be thinking about funding for the future? Equity. The pandemic has shown how critical transit is to those who need it most. How do we help those that most rely on transit? How do we equitably serve the region's transit needs? And then the last area is engagement. Each of you represent other people or work for a community of people. And so engagement is about understanding kind of the RTA's role in transit and how best we can engage with the region and stakeholders throughout the region. Go ahead to the next slide. So we'll start with a poll question around opportunities for impact. Cheryl, if you want to go ahead, there we go. So what is the greatest opportunity for impact in the strategic plan process? Where should we focus? This could be climate change, kind of joining other groups such as this one on focusing on that, state of good repair, investment in our infrastructure, jobs and economic development, access and accessibility, ensuring people can get to the train, that sidewalks connect to bus stops, or broader kind of societal benefits. You know, transit impacts a lot of things. Should we take more of a direct role in capturing that? So we'll give it a few more seconds here. All right, it looks like we have over 30 responses. A few more coming in, but I can kind of see, I think, where this is going. So number one response is climate change. And that resonates absolutely with other groups we've spoken to. Next up, it looks like access and accessibility is about 28% of the response. State of good repair, jobs and economy, and then societal benefits in that order. So we'll end that poll. And see the results there. And then we can go ahead and do the next one, the next poll question here. So we sensed it was likely that climate change would be a focus for this group. So a follow-up question: where should transit focus its efforts related to climate change? Should the focus be around electrification and green transit or green transit planning? So that's kind of the resilience of the system, electrification of fleets. Or should we focus on kind of the other side of things, mode shift away from driving and transit, be that on you know, a conventional diesel bus or an electric one in the future, has a great potential to reduce VMT. So I see answers are coming in here. And this is really interesting. It is almost a 50-50 split, it appears, between a few more answers for electrification and green transit. Great. So it looks like we have over 40 responses. We can close that one out. Looks like it ended up being 54% electrification, 46% mode shift. But great feedback. Go ahead and advance to the next slide. So now for the kind of discussion prompt here. Again, the first topic is opportunities for impact. The region's transit system has many benefits beyond the service itself, such as supporting equitable access to opportunity, enhancing quality of life, improving the air quality and the environment, combating climate change, same with you. This plan will create a forum to talk about transit's contribution to all of these benefits and to highlight a few in particular. But our purpose here today is to ask you, where should we focus? So go ahead to the next slide. Question is, what is the greatest opportunity for impact right now that the strategic plan process should address? And you can go ahead and advance one more. So these possibilities, again, kind of include the stuff we just took on the poll: climate change, health and education, strengthening the region's broader transportation system, economic growth development, or quality of life in local communities. So I'll open up the floor here. If people want to provide a comment, go ahead and speak when you're ready, or if it's easier, type something into the chat and we can read that into the record as well.
And also
Thank you.
raise your hand,
Yeah.
and Kevin and I can call on you if you have a comment.
It's good stuff, Peter. Thank you very much.
There are 50 of us here, so just so we can monitor everybody's desire to speak.
Right.
All of the above. That's great. That's great feedback.
Yeah.
Sure.
I have a question for you, Peter, or perhaps a statement. Now, oftentimes we hear in this space that, or perhaps it's just me that hears this, there seems to be either a disconnect, or perhaps we haven't found the appropriate connection between economic development and environmental stewardship. In that regard, does one not cancel the other, or can one complement the other from your perspective?
I certainly think that they can complement one another. I think the way that we interact with that most directly is probably around TOD and some of these development projects that we get involved with through our community planning program. But you know, there's some, the Bedford Park example is I think a great one about thinking about TOD. Usually it's focused on residences having access to jobs at the other end of the train line.
Exactly.
But I think we need to take a better approach, or maybe do more to look at going the other direction. So reverse commuters, getting out to job access in suburban communities. Or sometimes something that comes up with other stakeholder groups is this idea of, you know, a lot of people may live in the CTA service area, but work in the PACE or Metra service area.
Right.
And we need to coordinate better across the three so that we can make those trips as seamless as possible.
Well, you know, Peter, we have that example. I know my friend from Batavia, Abby Beck, and some others are on this Zoom as well. We have that exact example you just cited in Kane County. We have multiple employees coming from CTA communities, Chicago, heading out via Metra, and then having to get to their quote offices. And there's that lack of, I'll put it this way, in air quotes, sidewalk, whether it be a bus, whether it be what have you.
Mm-hmm.
We have one organization in town that employs virtually all PhDs, and all PhDs choose to live where it's a little more exciting than Geneva, Illinois, in the city. And they opt to drive their cars because of the inconvenience as they see it in terms of schedule. So it's a huge challenge, no question about it.
Right. I can see we're getting some good comments in the chat as well. I'll read a few of these. RTA must show leadership in climate issues. So where they put their money is critical. Electric buses or diesel buses will send a strong message. Absolutely agree with that. Strengthening the broader transportation system should be number one. We've heard that as well a lot. Quality of life improvements, such as increasing connectivity, reliability, electrification of transit. And then strengthening the region's broader transportation system appears to me as the core foundation of these other items. And we create a domino effect on the other options listed here.
Right.
So my vote is for strengthening, broadening the transportation system. It looks like we do have two hands up. So David, if you want to go ahead and unmute and speak.
Yeah, David Poe with the Village of Schaumburg here. I think that all of these possibilities look great, but strengthening the region's broader transportation system is definitely something the village would love to see a focus on, and all of our residents would like to see that as well. In particular, on that reverse commute you referred to earlier, Peter. I personally commute in from the city of Chicago, but also we have a massive employment center here in Schaumburg in the Woodfield area, and we're redeveloping the 90 North District as well on the Meacham Road and 90 North Corridor. That will have an explosion of employment over the next 10 years. So seeing those reverse commute patterns increase, we would love to see a strengthening of those options for people coming from the east part of Chicagoland to Schaumburg and the northwest suburbs.
Great feedback. Thank you. Kim, if you want to go ahead with your comment as well.
Yep, thanks. This is Kim Stone. I'm a council member in Highland Park. And I just want to build on what I put in the chat, that all of these things are interconnected. You know, I think getting out of your car improves your quality of life. So if you have a better transit system, you can take transit, you don't have to have a car, or you can be in it less, that's going to improve your quality of life. It's going to reduce congestion. It's going to reduce air pollution. It's all so interconnected. And then all of those things, of course, help in terms of climate change. So I just wanted to get that in to the record.
Absolutely. Thank you for the comment.
Anyone else? Chime in.
I have a question. I'm Linda Christensen, and I'm on the LaGrange Environmental Quality Control Commission. The interesting statistic to me was the idea that only 35% of Chicago's offices are currently occupied. And I'm wondering if you have some projections about how that is likely to change and whether you're adjusting your planning with that in mind.
So are you asking if we have projections on kind of what telecommute impacts will be in the more long term?
Yes. Yes.
That's $1 million question. I would be lying if I said we knew. I would also say that, you know, we did a scenario planning project two summers ago, like really right in the midst of the kind of the worst of the pandemic. And at that point, our projections for how long this really deep telecommute would continue, we've far exceeded kind of what we thought that might be at this point. Every attempt we've made to project what telecommute will be in the future shows it as a growing mode. We don't think it's going away. We don't think, you know, people are just going to return to downtown jobs. RTA as an employer, I've been to the office, I think, less than 10 times total in the last 18 months. That 100% we think that things are fundamentally shifting as far as where people work and when and how. The question will be, do employers shrink their footprint downtown? Does that open up access to have more employers downtown? Does that change footprints for suburban locations? We don't know. We would be, I would not be telling the truth if I was trying to say that we know, but that is what we're paying attention to. The 35% that I cited is kind of an interesting data source. It's Castle Cards. That's the company that you use to swipe into your building. They produce a metric for the top 10 metros in the United States, and Chicago's at about 35% occupancy based on swipes. So that's where that's from.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It's a great question.
Just in the interest of time, I think we should continue, but great feedback. There is as well some stuff in the chat. We are monitoring all this. It will all be incorporated. But let's go ahead and advance the slide to the next poll question. So poll question 3. The question is, here we go. How much change is needed for public transit? So should the RTA pursue bold action, kind of fundamentally think differently about how we fund and plan transit? Should the RTA continue advancing our existing goals, which were largely around capital infrastructure, kind of investing in the system that we have? Or should RTA focus on planning for trade-offs, fiscal constraints? So we know that our system is going to struggle once federal funding runs out. And should that be the focus of our plan, is really focusing on kind of those trade-offs that we're going to be presented with in the future. So a few more answers coming in. Give it just one more second here. All right, so we're at over 30, and it looks like there's a clear winner here. RTA should pursue bold action, has over 70% of the vote, with the second one of continuing to advance existing goals being the least, only about 9%, and then the third option, focusing on the realities, planning for trade-offs, is getting about 18% of the vote. So we'll stop the poll there. Thank you again for your input, and we can advance the slide to the next kind of area for discussion is system adaptation. So how should the system change? The region's transit system, while robust in many ways, has been facing ridership declines dating back to 2012. The pandemic has only widened uncertainty about the region and what it will need from its transit system in the coming years. Many potential ideas for improving the transit system were included in our previous strategic plan, Invest in Transit, but progress has been limited, largely due to issues outside of what the agencies can control, funding constraints and competing demands. The strategic plan is an opportunity to reinvigorate and refocus discussion around opportunities for improvement, ways the system can adapt to meet the needs of communities throughout our region. So go ahead and advance. The question then becomes, what types of transit system changes should be the focus of this process? And go ahead and advance one more slide. So these are kind of the prompts, and I will open it up here in a second here. But these could include, focus on getting back to pre-COVID service levels. In suburban communities in particular, there's still a lot of service missing, a lot of PACE routes that have been suspended and have not returned yet. Another option could be kind of hosting a conversation about desirable transit service and mobility levels across the region. Laying out a plan to leverage different modes, try new things, new delivery methods that we haven't done previously. Another option would be to pursuing visionary expansion projects, looking at the transit system through additional service, extensions, new big options, kind of big ideas. Another option would be creating a regional fare and funding structure to address affordability, removing perhaps barriers that are created to ridership, and facilitate better transfers between the service boards. Another option could be advancing a robust region-wide capital program focused on system renewal, on projects that promote equity, reliability, sustainability, and accessibility, and implementation of green technologies, such as fleet electrification. So again here, the question is where to focus. What of these adaptation ideas kind of most resonates with people on the call and the communities that you represent here today?
I sense we might get all of the above on a lot of this, right?
That may be the case.
That may be the case.
It's definitely all of the above, but I think, some things come before others. Like on the one hand, you want to reestablish service levels, but on the other hand, you need to kind of rethink, given the post-COVID economy and the way people are traveling and moving around. So if people are only going into an office downtown a couple days a week, there may be some different way rather than reestablishing the exact same routes. And I've looked at some of the PACE routes here in Highland Park recently, and the service, the pre-COVID ridership levels began to drop around 2012. So there were long-standing issues with the routes here in my area perhaps not serving the needs within the community that need to be addressed rather than just reestablishing the same routes.
Right.
So I go with number 2, trying to figure out, where to go next, or number 3.
Great feedback. Thank you.
Appreciate
Looks like
it.
we have a
Yeah.
couple in the comments I'll read out loud here. From Ben, desirable transit service, adding more localized transit options to get from major hubs to targeted areas of interest. Another comment here from Glenn, rationalize the system based on best projections of ridership levels, which may not return to pre-COVID levels for many years. So that's, I think the Glenn's comment in particular kind of speaks to this concept of ridership or frequency of service versus kind of coverage of should we focus on cores, on corridors, or should we provide a base level of service everywhere? And it seems like Glenn's comment is saying to kind of focus on these corridors. Another comment here I'll read in from David, hosting a conversation about desirable transit service and mobility levels would give current riders and potential former riders an opportunity to provide feedback on what transit looks like. In particular, residents who no longer riding transit should be engaged on what could be done to get them on the train or bus. Great comment. We did a lapsed rider, non-rider survey during COVID that provided a lot of insight on kind of what people are doing and what they think they'll be doing in the future. We have another, next year, we will have a customer satisfaction survey that will likely include some questions around kind of people's plans for the future. Great comment from David, though. Just making sure we get through all of the topics here. Let's continue to the next one. So funding stability is kind of our third topic. We talked a little bit about kind of the changes in the balance that is lacking in our current system. And again, relief funds, federal relief funds have been used to sustain transit during 2020 and 2021. And they'll get us through the next couple of years while the RTA works with the region to establish a more long-term financial plan. So the strategic plan and 10-year financial plan process will be an opportunity for RTA and stakeholders to identify kind of mismatches between desired service levels and projected available public funding and fare revenue, and to develop strategies for addressing those mismatches. So for this one, we can advance the slide to the next poll question. And we're really just kind of asking at a high level here. In the future, transit, go ahead with the question as well. Transit may face a situation where federal COVID relief funds run out before ridership fully recovers. Should the transit system scale back service to kind of live within our means, or should we pursue additional funding sources for transit, which there's a number of different ways that could be approached, but that's kind of the two levers. You can scale back service, or you can try to find different ways to fund it. And looks like some answers are coming in now.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll let a few more people answer, but it does appear as though the second option, pursuing additional funding sources for transit, has a pretty clear advantage. About 89% of responses have said that in the event that we run out of relief funds, we should look for new ways to fund transit. Thank you for the feedback on that one. We can keep things rolling here and advance the next slide. So the next topic area is equity. Invest in Transit, the previous plan, focused on geographic equity, distributing investment across different parts of the region. Over the last year, other types of equity have been highlighted at regional, state, and federal levels. Those discussions have included RTA's work on using equity analysis as a component of allocating funds for sustaining critical transit service in 2021. Echoing other efforts within our region and state, and responding to calls from civic groups like NPC and other advocates in our region to be more direct in leveraging transit's inherent advantages towards equitable mobility. All of which is in line with efforts at the federal level from the Biden administration's executive order on advancing racial equity and support for underserved communities. So the strategic plan will provide a forum for talking about how to consider different forms of equity in funding and planning activities while maintaining regional parity in how resources are distributed. So go ahead to the next slide here. So the discussion question then is, what are some productive ways for the RTA to define, understand, and incorporate equity during this process? And you can advance, we'll give you some possible ideas to consider before responding, fostering a discussion about equity and what that means to kind of better understand the unique characteristics and transit needs of different communities across the 6-county region. Another idea could be developing shared regional equity statement or vision that can shape strategic direction and decision making. Another option could be establishing goals and performance measures to measure equity for service and capital project distribution, things that can be applied as part of the RTA budget process. Another option could be totally rethinking transit funding and service distribution at the regional level. To address the variety of equity concerns raised in public comments submitted to the RTA board recently, including those related to the framework for transit investment considered by the board in 2020, as well as the allocation of federal relief funding for March 2021. Or the last option, just kind of continuing to leverage transit's inherent advantage toward equitable mobility. Transit by nature is an equitable mode. You don't have to own a car to ride the bus. That's the idea. And instead, RTA could just focus on that, on increasing federal and state share of transportation funding on the basis of equity. So again, the question here is how can, where should we focus? Where should the RTA focus around the discussion of equity in this next strategic plan?
It's Kim Stone again. Sorry, I'm on my iPad, so it's hard to type. I think if, in order to make sure that you really hear the voices of people in diverse communities and in underserved communities, you need to think creatively about how to get them involved and how to get their input, because people who are spending more than an hour perhaps commuting each way and have perhaps more than one job and childcare issues and everything else are going to have difficulty attending a public hearing or a meeting. That's not something that necessarily fits into their schedules. So I think thinking creatively about how to get input from some of the communities that really need transit is really important.
Great feedback. Thank you. There's a comment very related to that that I'll read out loud. How can the RTA get these questions in front of people that the previous presenter reported on are the main users of transit during COVID times? Women, people of color, low-income riders. Absolutely, that is a challenge to get direct input from the people that need the service most. It's not necessarily the audiences that are easiest for us to connect with. So another comment here from Emily, rethinking funding and service distribution creates the framework of how you can tackle equity issues, discussion, creating goals, statements, etc. And then that will make them come to fruition. Another comment from Marcus, rethinking transit funding and service distribution at the regional level to focus on equity. All good feedback. I'll read one more comment in here from Michaela. These are all good possibilities. Echo what David, with all of the above, more specifically fostering discussions with communities about equity and establishing goals and performance measures for measuring equity. Definitely kind of a recurring theme here of getting this message out to the people that we need their input the most, people that are impacted the most by this. Then one more from Ben here, ensuring connectivity to areas of highest need based on income and employment. Great, so let's advance to the last topic area here, which is very related to some of the feedback that we're getting. The last topic is engagement. So RTA's recent strategic discussions, including development of our previous plan, invest in transit, some scenario planning we did at the kind of the height of the pandemic in 2020. We invited numerous government, civic, academic, advocacy organizations. Staff have and will continue to engage a lot of perspectives in this process. But here we want to ensure that we are continuously broadening our audience and engaging with the right people and in the right ways. So the question then, go ahead and advance, is who should we engage during this process? And I'll kind of put up the bullets here to show who we for sure will engage or already are engaging. Leadership and staff from the service boards will obviously be a crucial element of this process. Leadership from other units of government, local, regional, state, and even the federal level will be involved. Civic groups and advocates working throughout the region, leaders within the disability community across the region, business organizations, economic development leaders, both in the city as well as in suburban job centers, academic researchers and other thought leaders in transportation and related fields, and then members of the public. Members of the public are, as kind of the equity discussion highlighted, sometimes the most challenging to engage with directly, particularly when the RTA is the funding and planning agency. We don't drive the bus, we fund it, and that's harder to explain to people sometimes why that's important, why they should care and have an opinion. But from your perspective, who else may not be represented on this list? Or if you have specific ways, if there are standing committee meetings or groups that already exist that we can go to, we would be happy to hear that feedback as well.
Peter, a quick question for you directly. Under civic groups and advocates, would you loop in, or let me see here, economic development leaders, would you loop in tourism councils as well?
Tourism is one that I don't know that we have engaged with previously, but that's great feedback. And I will say that with the ridership that has returned, some of the biggest days that we've had have been around tourist events. Lollapalooza saw a huge bump for Metra ridership, where in a
I was there every day, by the way.
Great. It looked like a lot of fun.
Thanks for believing that, Peter.
I do agree, though, that in the same way that it seems like the commuter segment is never going to be what it was, or it's going to be different in some way. That's another opportunity, is looking more at both out-of-state tourists traveling within the city, but local tourists as well, taking Metra from the suburbs in on a weekend, or taking Metra from the city out. I do that occasionally. I go out to McHenry County on the UP Northwest, but the schedules aren't well aligned for that. It's challenging to use Metra as anything but a commuter rail service.
And this is our final question, ladies and gentlemen, so please chime in. We want to be respectful of your time. We've got just a few minutes left, and there's a few announcements to make as well. So
I'll read a few from comments here. Working more directly with environmentalists should be included in conversations. Definitely hear that, coming to this group and this environmental committee is part of some of the initial feedback we've received. Tourism may be an interesting perspective to mitigate recycling waste surges in the context of transit and TOD. Something else to think about there. Representing an area in the northwest suburbs, I think it's important to engage people who are not currently taking transit, but might have the ability, time, means, etc., to do so. That's a great comment, and a group that's very hard to reach. I've seen some interesting examples in our region with things like providing a free Metra ticket to someone who recently moved into the area, or there's an initiative, I believe, in Lake County for new residents, and as well, I think they're trying to roll it out to new employers as well, to like proactively kind of show people what their transit options are when they are first coming into a region. Aging networks, that's another good one. Go Green Illinois would welcome the opportunity to host this presentation. Keep that in mind as well. Hopefully RTA can engage community-based public safety efforts and leaders in this area. A lot of good comments coming in. Religious institutions, it's another one as well.
Very good.
Peter, this is Edith. As we're approaching the bottom of the hour here, there's two unrelated questions that I'd like to pull out of the chat. So if you are ready to wrap up, I'm gonna give you two more questions that are in the chat that have been.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay. Are you ready, or you got any closing?
No, this is the closing slide. Thank you so much for inviting us here today. This has been great feedback. And again, we are recording and documenting everything here. If we didn't get your comment read into the record, it is documented, and it will be incorporated into our work.
Great, thank you, Peter.
So the questions that I'd just like to see if you can give a quick question for. This is from the R1 Planning Council in Rockford area. Can you share any value capture techniques if you have explored them?
That's a great question, and something that I think most transit agencies really struggle with is, yeah, I don't know that I can answer directly. If this person wants to email me, we can have a conversation offline. You know, I guess like a more direct example would be with the Bedford Park pilot that we did, mobility pilot. We used a calculator actually that was produced, I think, or at least was shared with us by MPC, that tries to quantify in dollar terms what transportation impacts are on attrition for employers, showing that if you are likely to lose this many employees over the course of the year based on their ability to get to work, whether or not they can access the job site, and then kind of quantifying that in dollar terms, what that means to your organization. You can make the argument pretty quickly that even a subsidized TNC ride completing the last mile that might cost the organization $10 or something might be actually more valuable and a more economic choice if you can reduce attrition by, say, 5% for a large organization or a large manufacturer or something. That's kind of a direct example. There's obviously lots of value capture is a really broad term. If they had something more specific in mind, I'd be happy to have an offline conversation with it, though.
And Peter, one more question, probably of a similar ilk here, is can you address autonomous vehicles in transit?
Autonomous vehicles, we don't have any direct plans right now to pilot an AV or anything along those lines. We keep a very watchful eye on what others are doing in other regions, and there are some really exciting things that are happening. There's an RFI right now in the state of New Jersey looking for a company to offer kind of a non-fixed, completely autonomous last mile type service to connect in with regional rail. I think AVs and the technology are absolutely on the horizon and something that transit needs to be paying attention to. And I think that will happen soon in our region, but there's no immediate plans or pilots or anything to point to at this point.
Peter, again, thank you very much.
My pleasure to be here. Thanks so much for all the input. And thanks again to Mayor Burns and the caucus for hosting us.
Thank you. Edith, you want to make a couple announcements before we announce the next meeting date, or?
Sure, why don't you do the next meeting date, and then
Okay.
I will
It's going to be a good one, folks. January 18th from 10 to 11:30. We're going to discuss clean energy opportunities in the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act, CEJA, and the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, EJA, with our dear friend, a friend of the caucus, a friend of the state, a friend of clean energy everywhere, Mark Pruitt. So please join us for that. I think it's going to be, it's not only timely, it's going to be rich in information. So I'm particularly looking forward to that one.
Great. So my announcements, just want to make a reminder to everyone that Cheryl does a great job of posting the recording and the slide decks and the agendas and meeting notes and everything on our website. So those, I just put that in the chat. The other two things that I wanted to announce was we've been involved in the beneficial electrification meetings, which what that means is in the implementation of CEJA, the Illinois Commerce Commission is seeking input on how to develop the provisions of CEJA related to transportation electrification. So we've been promoting and encouraging you all to participate in the workshops. They are long. I will warn you of that. And tomorrow's, I'll ask Cheryl. Yep, she's just put that in the chat. There is one tomorrow, and it's on fleets, particularly related to government fleets. So if you have an opportunity to drop in, they're not recorded. So if you have something to say, you might want to be a part of it, or check the agenda and see if you can at least drop in for some of it. So that's tomorrow. And she just put the other chat in for the one that's coming up in January. They are important. This has to do with getting in front of the grant funding and the definitions that are CEJA implementation related. My second announcement, I've been getting a lot of questions about the status of the Greenest Region Corps. And if I can just update, if anyone doesn't know what our Greenest Region Corps is, that is our shared program with the AmeriCorps program, in which we help create positions in place, very talented staff to serve in local governments for almost a year. Cheryl, if I could ask you to post the link to that so those who don't know yet our program can look at that. We have had a timeline. This would have been the 4th year of our program, and we are off the timeline because of the situation with the Serve Illinois Commission. They have new leadership. Now they're switching departments, which and they're 5 months behind where they should be. We had a very unfortunate occurrence last year with the Greenest Region Corps with the Serve Illinois Commission. Our contract wasn't honored, and so in an abundance of caution, we're waiting for a signed contract from Serve Illinois, which again is at this point 4 months behind. So when we get that, which there are deadlines that we've been told before, we're expecting one before the end of the year, but it is much delayed. It's not going away. It's just much delayed. And likewise with calling for new projects. So those of communities who have already requested a Greenest Region Corps member and that service position, we've been in touch with you. Those, if the contract comes through, we will still look to try to get some service in beginning next year. And you know who you are, those communities that have already applied. Those communities that we're hoping to get into this next cycle, which should start service of September 2022, that is also delayed. We ask for your interest this time of year. We put it into an application that goes to Serve Illinois, and then we let you know when we hear that we have those positions available. That's also delayed. So they are promising to post that application in January, and we will be in touch with you. So don't think the program's gone away. It's just struggling. No lack of interest. And then those of you who are former Greenest Region Corps members, in the chat, if you would raise your hand or a thumbs up, because we're really proud of the great work that they've done, including Cheryl on our own team as a former Greenest Region Corps member. So I wanted to respond to some questions that I've had about that. So thanks.
Very good. Again, everyone, thank you so much for joining us. Thanks to our panelists. Thanks to all of you for your continued passion about the work we're trying to achieve. Again, a happy Tuesday. For those of you who are unaware, I believe today is the 100th anniversary of Joy Morton from the Morton family signing off on paperwork to create the Morton Arboretum. So if you want to see what long-standing sustainability can do, go visit our folks in Lisle at the Morton Arboretum. Today's their 100th anniversary. So with that, go have a great week and continue to do the good work. We're all available anytime you need us. So again, thank you very much.